Martin Kaz. Благодарю вас за внимание. That's all the Russian we have for you today. The rest of our program will be primarily in English. I am delighted to be here at the invitation of the Moscow Business Square and to host this panel on co-production financing with a particular focus, but not an exclusive focus, on Canada. There is an illustrious panel of people joining me. I will introduce them to you briefly, and we look forward to a lively and interesting conversation today about film financing, at the end of which we will reserve some time for specific questions from you, the audience. To my extreme right, physically, my close friend Hal Sadoff. Hal's been in the film business for almost 3 decades, certainly over 2 decades, as one of the foremost film financing bankers, and most recently as a lead packaging agent for one of the lead talent agents in Los Angeles. Hal and I have worked together closely on a number of projects, and his experience is absolutely invaluable, and I think he'll shed some real light on today's topic. To my near right, Kevin Tierney. Kevin is a producer from Canada. He has the distinction of being an Anglophone producer in the predominantly Francophone city of Montreal in the province of Quebec. He also has the great distinction of being the producer of the highest grossing Canadian film ever made, Bon Cop, Bad Cop. And I trust that his experiences producing films, both co-productions and Canadian films, and distributing them nationally and internationally will be significant and helpful for us today. On my extreme left, I have the pleasure of introducing Miranda de Pencier. Miranda is a Canadian producer who lives primarily in Los Angeles. She is the poster child of successful independent cinema producers today, having produced the very low-budget feature film Adam, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, I think?
It did.
Some years ago, and most recently, the outrageously successful and also low-budget, but not as low-budget, film Beginners, for which our countryman Christopher Plummer won a well-deserved Academy Award in the role of Best Supporting Actor. And to my near left, Елена Баранова, who has the great distinction of being herself a Canada-Russia co-production. She was born here, but moved to Canada when she was 17. She now lives primarily in Los Angeles when she's not traveling the world on the various productions that she's working on, including the one she's working on currently in Budapest. And Elena and I have looked at a number of projects over the years that are potential Canada-Russia co-productions, and she's here today to talk about her experience with that and her experience with a particular film which might well be a successful Canada-Russia co-production should it get made later this year or early next year. I will just say a few words about the Canada-Russia Treaty, and we'll go into a broader discussion, but we talk a lot about co-productions, and Elena has talked about co-productions and about the goal of finding a way to co-produce between Canada and Russia. Canada has 54 treaties with 49 countries. We're the most treatied country in the world. We pioneered the co-production treaty business. We have a robust system of state support and television quotas, which allows for higher values in Canada for Canadian films. And those higher values extend not only to Canadian films, but also to films that are co-productions. The treaty that we signed with Russia in the final days of the Soviet Union, which is still in place, has yet to see a Canadian-Russian co-production actually produced. Maybe today we can change that together. The value of a co-production, as I said, is that the product of a co-production, which is a film or television program, that is co-produced and the copyright to which is shared by a producer from Canada and a producer from Russia, is that such a film is considered Canadian in the Canadian context, which means it's eligible for subsidies that Canadian films are eligible for. It's considered Canadian content for the quota systems that television broadcasters are required to meet, and therefore it has a higher sale value in Canada as a co-production than it would if it were a non-Canadian picture. I think one of the reasons we haven't done a co-production with Russia in the past is because it's not clear that a Russian film or a film that's produced under the Canada-Russia Treaty has also or significantly similar subsidy or state supports or quota supports. I believe that state of affairs has changed dramatically recently, and that may be the first step to actually encouraging the production of a film under the terms of the treaty. Broadly speaking, the treaty requires that each of the co-producers invest at least 20% of the budget of the film and therefore own at least 20% of the copyright of the film. So the copyright is shared between the co-producers. And similarly, the treaty requires that the creative, artistic, and technical participants in the film, that is the actors, the key creative personnel, and the behind-the-scenes personnel and crew, be roughly proportional to the investment of each of the respective co-producers. So if a producer puts up 20% of the budget, they would expect to own 20% of the copyright, to be entitled to about 20% of the back end, and to have nationals of their country represent about 20% of the creative, technical, and artistic crew and cast of the film. The thing the treaty doesn't say, of course, is that when you co-produce, you are in a relationship with your co-producer, a relationship that's very much more like marriage than it is like anything else. It's very difficult to get it divorced in a co-production, and then children end up very unhappy. It's certainly possible to put films together by co-financing without co-production. We'll talk about that today. That's a little more like sleeping around. You get the benefits of having partners without the difficulties entailed in divorce. But before we get into the specifics of that kind of financing and address them either in the context of this conversation that comes up in the panel or of the specific questions, I want to turn the microphone over to Hal and ask you, Hal, in particular, to give us a sense of the state of film financing generally, because it's often said, you know, that in Canada we don't make Canadian films. I'm sure it's said in the same way in Russia that one doesn't make Russian films. We're all in the business of making independent films. We all have the same challenge, which is that compared to the output of the American studio system, we're all in the independent business. Everything we do is an independent film. We're never going to make a $250 million studio movie. So everything else is an independent film. And I would ask Hal to give us a sense, to contextualize our conversation with a view of the state of the independent film business today.
Thank you, Marty. It's a very interesting thing going on in the, I think, global film business, but especially in North America and in the States. These film studios are really focusing on big budget tentpole movies. Batman, Superman, Iron Man, all these enormous films that have budgets in, $100 million, $200 million, then another $100 million for print and advertising costs to release the film, which means that they have limited capacity to do that many films. They have just a certain amount of money to allocate towards their film production business. And what that does to the whole industry is many actors aren't working, directors aren't working, writers aren't working, and there's a number of people looking for jobs. However, while that's happening, the studios still have the distribution capacity and the ability to distribute movies. And there are some new, smaller distribution companies coming on board. And this has created, I think, what I think is an opportunity and a very interesting situation for independent filmmakers and independent film financiers. Actors are available, directors are available at much lower prices than they were before because they need to work. So what we're seeing is, more commercial independent films at lower budgets, with a higher level of talent available. I worked at a talent agency over the last 8 years or so, and when I joined just 8 years ago, it was very difficult to get a talent agent to get one of their actors into an independent film. They say, well, he normally gets, or she normally gets, $5 million for a movie. Today, they're begging producers and financiers to put their actors into movies because there aren't enough movies going around. And that's why you see a phenomenon happening in the States where a lot of big actors and directors are doing television and television series through HBO or Showtime or even network television. Also, the thing that's happening for financiers coming into the industry, there's more of a floor value on the U.S. rights of films today because of video on demand. The video business, the typical DVD business, is declining dramatically. But what's happening is the VOD business is increasing. It hasn't caught up to the DVD business yet, but it's putting a floor value on the film. 5 years ago, I used to sell a lot of films to distributors. We would sell for video on demand. We'd get $25,000 or $50,000 for a film. Today, for that same film, we could get $500,000, $750,000, or even $1 million. And that's only increasing. So I think for financiers, it's more of a cushion and a floor value for the U.S. rights. So all in all, I think it's a real opportunity for independent filmmakers today and financiers with what's happening in the industry.
Nice. Just a quick question. You say that the opportunity for independent producers is that because fewer films are getting made, because there's in Hollywood as tentpole films, there's just less work around for actors. Is it also the case, or are we fooling ourselves about this? Is it also the case that actors are looking for more interesting roles?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. If you look at the Oscars over the last 10 years, most of the films were independent films. And the actors feel that it's resurged careers, it's more interesting work, and they're more willing to work on these independent films. That's correct.
Okay. Thanks. We'll come back to some of that, but I want to, in that context, turn maybe to Miranda now, if I may, and ask you to talk about your experience. Again, continuing this discussion about financing generally. You've been able to put together some remarkably successful, low-budget dramas, attract interesting talent to them, to the extent that you've actually been nominated for and won Academy Awards for talent in your films. Maybe you want to talk about your new film or your recent films in that context, and tell us about the way you look at financing, the way you've been able to, what you do as a producer, before we talk about what you would do with a treaty if you had one.
Hi, thanks so much. We're so excited to be here. Just to go on what Hal, just to kind of add to what Hal said, I totally agree. I think that there is a big opportunity for independent film right now, and I would say partially it's because there's not as much money out there for mid-range movies, so the budgets are decreasing, and for independent films to even get sold, they've got to be made for a really low amount of money. I think even that mid-range, the sort of 8 to 25 range is hard unless there's a real genre picture. So smart independent dramas and comedies are getting made for significantly less. And also, because the risk is so great for the studios, they are wanting to do these tentpole films that have built-in audiences. They're going with known brands. They're going with sequels, things they know that are going to make a lot of money. And so what's happening is actors are desperate for interesting writing and interesting work. And so the studios are getting safer and safer, and therefore the actors are like, well, where's the interesting work happening? It's happening in the independent world. So I actually think it's a great time to be an independent filmmaker. And just the last couple of movies I've made, so Beginners is an example. We made that film for, I will say, under $5 million, significantly under $5 million. And we had Ewan McGregor and Christopher Plummer in the cast. And we paid them really next to nothing. But I think Christopher saw it as a film that potentially could be award-worthy, and it was. And Ewan fell in love with the movie, and Mike Mills is a really interesting filmmaker. And so for those actors, they were willing to take a risk and come on board the movie. I've just locked picture on a new film called Thanks for Sharing. The director, Stuart Blumberg, wrote The Kids Are All Right, so he's the writer-director of the film. And our cast includes Mark Ruffalo, Gwyneth Paltrow, Tim Robbins, the pop star Pink, Jolie Richardson. Who am I missing? And it's really a phenomenal cast, and we basically paid the actors hardly anything up front, and we paid them instead an ownership. So they all have a piece of the back end, and they all came on board because they loved the material. So to me, it's really exciting to be able to be finding talent that there's no way. 5 years ago, we would never have had that cast for a tiny little independent film. They would have cost way too much money. But they're all willing to do it because there's not as many films being made, and there's not as many good films, and they're all craving work. So the crazy thing is, you don't actually need a lot of money to draw big actors these days. You need great material. Really, that's what it comes down to.
A couple quick questions. In Beginners, you also had that fabulous French actress.
Melanie Laurent.
She was stunning in the film.
Yeah.
And, sometimes people bring me projects and we look at them and think, well, you have to sell your project. You have to sell it to a distributor. You have to sell it to a number of distributors. You have to go to distributors and sell the project to distributors who will put the movie in cinemas and expect people to come and pay money and sit in seats and watch the movie. That's the business we're in. We're in the business of selling tickets to movies so people will come to the movie theater and sit in seats and watch the movie. That's our business. Our business is selling tickets to movies. And people go to the movies and buy tickets when they recognize who's in the movie, generally speaking. If they don't recognize who's in the movie, it's very, very difficult to get them to buy tickets to come and see the movie. You have a movie in which Ewan McGregor is very well known. Christopher Plummer's been in movies since that singing movie he hates to refer to, and probably before that. And now you've got Melanie Laurent, who is a terrific, well-recognized actress in France. Do you know, did Melanie Laurent have an influence on your French sale, for example?
Well, I can definitely tell you, we got, the Melanie Laurent story was fascinating because we had Ewan and Christopher, and then we were greenlit, and every single actress in Hollywood was suddenly wanting our movie. So we were in the, you spend years and years trying to get one actor in your film, and then you finally do in your greenlit. In this stage, we were sitting there with agents calling every day, like, please put, and these were big name actresses, and I was sitting there going, oh my God, like I've never in my life just had agents begging to have their actress in the film. But we ended up, Mike Mills, the director, was interested in potentially hiring a foreign actress, just honestly because he liked the idea of having a foreign actress in the film. And we were really fortunate that we were fully financed, for a low enough money, so our financier was risking not a lot, and therefore he was willing to take a chance and didn't need a name in that role. Very often, we would actually need to get an actress to help the foreign sales numbers. In this case, he was willing to take the flyer, and he said to the filmmaker, you know what, pick who you guys want. So we were in that rare position of just getting the best actress. And we were very close to hiring a well-known Hollywood actress in that part. And Melanie Laurent sent a tape. And honestly, it was one of the most brilliant audition tapes I've ever seen in my life. She acted the whole thing out in her apartment and on a street corner. And, you know, I mean, if you've auditioned actors before, you know, they're sitting with their mic and they've got the, you know, boring white wall behind them and they're reading against, you know, whoever their boyfriend or the casting director, and it's pretty stagnant. She created this brilliant, funny, emotional artwork of a demo reel, which was a bit risky because the director could have, you know, it could have gone the wrong way, but it was so brilliant. We all looked at it, and it was undeniable that she had to get the part. So that was really fun to get to cast her, and I think she was really amazing. And sometimes I always think it's dangerous to cast just to get your movie made. Because even if that actor does it, but they're not quite right for the role, in the end, your film is going to be that piece of art with that actor, and if it doesn't fit, it's not going to work, and it's never going to work. So to just get your movie financed and made, to me, it's not worth it. And Melanie, she fit like a glove. It was a bit of a risk because we thought, wow, we don't know how our sales are going to go, but it ended up being artistically right, and I think for that, it was worth it.
And that's a great story. Did it help your French sale?
It did help our French sale. Actually, Melanie we were at the Toronto Film Festival, and we hadn't sold France yet, and Melanie was drinking with a French buyer, and then she comes up to me and she goes, "I just sold the French rights." She had been feeding him wine, so yes, she claims that she'd made our French sale for us.
Very good. I was auditioning an actor for a role some years ago, and he was one of the sons of Donald Sutherland, and we got his tape, and he was delivering his lines against a white background, as you say, to a microphone, and then the sound of the other character in the scene came over the speakers, and it was undeniably Donald Sutherland's voice. He was reading with his dad for the part. So that was a bit of a giveaway. He didn't get the role, but he's very good. He's very good. He might have been good.
You can't mistake Donald's voice for anything.
One of the other things you said, before we push on, is you talked about Stuart Bloomberg, the writer-director. One of the things that I think it's worth noting is, again, when you go to cast, do you want to talk about that process of, you know, cast, you know, talent looks at pictures because there's an opportunity to act and an opportunity, we can just wait till you get that. Just kidding. There's an opportunity to do the material, but it is also true, and I think it's particularly significant when we're doing these pitching sessions. The talent is coming to work with the director. Do you want to talk about that dynamic between Stuart and your?
I mean, I honestly.
I just say because to have a film, wouldn't you agree, Hal, that to have a film that's a $5 million movie that has an ensemble cast, that's Mark Ruffalo. I mean, 5 years ago, you would expect, if they get Mark Ruffalo in one of those roles, you wouldn't kind of care. You wouldn't expect to have anyone else in the other roles. But to have an entire ensemble cast like that at a budget that is a micro budget, it's actually smaller than a number of the films that were pitched this morning, and with an outrageously competitive cast, is a real, not only an accomplishment, but an indication of what it takes to get movies made these days.
Well, it's definitely a testament to Stuart, and his screenplay, The Kids Are All Right, he'd been nominated for an Academy Award the year before, so that certainly helped actors want to work with him and be interested in him. To me, as a producer, and I'd be curious if everyone agrees with me on the panel, I would say the most important thing is the script. I mean, really, that is where it all comes from. And you can have all your bells and whistles, and you can even have a great director, but if you don't have great material, the actors are reading that script, and that's what they make or break wanting to do a film. And great writing really turns actors on, frankly.
I completely agree. It all starts with the script. It has to be a fantastic script to attract the actors in the first place. Then they want to sit with the director and make sure that the director has that creative vision, they're comfortable with the director.
Yeah, and Stuart's incredibly, I mean, not all writers translate to directors, but Stuart really was a natural and knows his writing and knew this material so well and could speak about it passionately. So these actors all got into a room with Stuart, and Stuart was able to meet with each of them and talk about how much he wanted them specifically in the part and why. And it is a really important, it's an important step to make sure that your filmmaker can speak truthfully and intelligently and passionately about their vision and what they want to say and what they want to do, to get actors involved, for sure.
Turning in a way to the particular context of Canada, I want to ask Kevin. Kevin, you made a film not too long ago in the wake of Bon Cop, Bad Cop, I think, that was a terrific success in Canada and, startlingly, a terrific success in Russia as well, called The Trotsky. Do you want to talk about putting that Trotsky, not the Trotsky? There's only one Trotsky.
Bring Trotsky back to Russia. Yes, I just want to ask Miranda, though, how much did the dog, did the dog bring in business in beginners? No. It's always good to have a dog.
That was the artist.
Yeah, did you have a dog too? Didn't yours talk?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
We had big auditions for that dog.
Talking dog.
We auditioned 10 dogs before we cast that dog.
Sure you saw that movie. Well, yeah, I can talk about the Trotsky. That's another example of a movie where, in Canada, because the examples that Miranda was using, we obviously have passport issues. That is to say that a Canadian film that is made under the Canadian system with federal and or provincial financing must accept casting situations that call for at least the first or second lead actor to be Canadian. And in fact, if we just look at a Canadian movie, you're basically, the Actors Union in Canada, ACTRA, will allow you one star and one cameo. So you couldn't, that means that for Canadian producers, you're always running to Los Angeles to find all the Canadians. And there are a lot of them. That's a good thing, but that is yet it's another situation. So we were lucky in the Trotsky to get this kid actually from Montreal. His name is Jay Baruchel, and he was just after we signed him. He signed to do a Jerry Bruckheimer movie that died, but was a huge Nicolas Cage movie. So that obviously helped us a lot. But again, I agree with my colleagues. It absolutely is the script. And that, just to bring it back to the purpose of this discussion, since in the last 15 or 20 years, I've probably had at least 10 scripts from Russia proposed to me. Yes, absolutely. Because, it's clear. We have two great things in common: winter and hockey. And almost every one of those movies has been about hockey. And hockey takes place in the winter. Unfortunately, all of those, just one of the things that Marty mentioned at the beginning when he was trying to set up, a very well done as well, about co-productions, is that one of the key factors in the co-production is not just the financing, it's called the spend. We follow the money. So that it's one thing to have 20%, but almost every one of those projects that I got over the last 15 years from Russia was, please bring cash. We have everything, right? So it's like, we are going to spend our money, our cash, in Russia. It doesn't work that way. So we really have to find an equitable situation. As we all agree, the script's the thing. If you want to send a script to Canada in English or in French, almost all of those 10 or 15 scripts it was just really badly written, badly translated. It was maybe a really good story, but it was unbelievably painful to read. And so, you get it. You say, well, what am I going to do with this? All right? Because you have to really find the script and not just the deal, because it is too complicated to do. It has to be a script that will work for both audiences. and then you can put together the talent based around it.
Well, you bring me so eloquently and elegantly to the discussion with Elena about a script that may do both of those things. But first, I'll just interject. It is true that in a co-production, the financing you bring from each country is intended to be spent in rough proportion to the investment within each country. So if a Russian producer brings 20% of the financing to the film and 20% of the creative, technical, and artistic personnel are Russian, it's also true that the treaty expects that 20% of the budget will be spent on Russian elements, more or less. That doesn't mean you need to be in Russia to spend that money, but as we know, if there's investment from Russia, it's in rubles, and it's not that easy, may not even be legal, to export rubles to Canada and spend them there. The same thing is true. Hal and I have had some experience in South Africa. The investment from South Africa would be in rand. And it is certainly true that it's not legal to export rand and spend them in another country. They have export controls on their currency, and the rand must be spent within South Africa. Now, in that case, we spent almost all our money in South Africa, although we had Canadian, British and Italian money, and a little tiny bit of American money, and we spent that on our actors and our above-the-line talent, but all of our below-the-line expenses were incurred within South Africa. I just finished a film called Cosmopolis with the great Canadian director David Cronenberg. It was a Canada-France co-production, and we did all of the production in Canada and a little bit of post-production in France. And so it wasn't entirely organic to the process, except that the value of a Cronenberg film in France is very high. And as was Miranda's experience, we had casting that benefited greatly from the fact that we had a French partner. We had the great Juliette Binoche and the great Mathieu Amalric, who were in our film and added greatly to the film. Not despite the fact that they were French, but because of the fact that they were French, they helped our French partner bring financing, and they helped us bring foreign sales, and they actually added overall to the creative value of the film. So in your 15 years,
did you have a dog?
We had no dog in the film, which may be a problem. We should probably look at that. We could probably add one in post with a little CG. You did. Now you made me. I was going to ask you that over the 15 years during which every 14 months you got a Russian script that you hated, were there other films that you co-produced with other countries because you liked them, or have you never co-produced with another country, and are you therefore poorly placed on this panel to comment?
No, I have co-produced with other countries. I have, early in my career when I was much more masochistic, I tried co-producing with France. Horrible place to co-produce with, but the food's terrific. I co-produced with England. Again, there's a real, there's real surprises when you discover that, a dollar equals a pound. Mm-hmm. So in your Canadian budget, you've got, say, 250,000 Canadian dollars for post-sound. And then when you have to shift that to England, it's 250,000 still, but it's pounds, not dollars. That's a considerable difference. I almost co-produced with Ireland until the Irish producer couldn't come through with the money. And literally with 6 weeks, a month before pre-production started, a month before we started actually shooting in Ireland, we had to turn that co-production, which was an 80-20, into 100% Canadian. Now, I won't bore you with the details of that, but having gone through all of those figures, I think it made me eligible to join the Cirque du Soleil.
I knew Kevin before that production, and his hair was quite dark at that time. And it's quite silvery now, if I may say.
You may.
Thank you. And I had a very positive experience co-producing with the French. and with the English, though never, and with the Irish. I've co-produced with all of those countries.
So it's clearly I'm the problem.
I think it's you.
It is, yeah.
No, but you highlight an important point, which is that when you're co-producing, you're working with partners. This goes back to my point about getting married. You need to, not only are you relying on them to bring some financing and to bring some expertise from their country and to bring production resources from their country, but you're relying on them to spend your money. They're going into your production bank account and spending your money, whether it's in their country or your money or your country. You can't make your movie without both of you doing what you said you were going to do. So you really need, as in marriage, to want to know who these people are and whether you want to spend 2 or 3 or 4 years of your life working together. Good partners make good productions.
And then there is the fact that I think fundamental to the notion of producing is that it is a profession, a métier, that control freaks are drawn to. I think when you know...
Present company excluded.
Yeah, no. I think all of us are. I think being a producer is you really do, part of it is needing to feel you're in control of something. And when you're doing a co-production, obviously it's like a marriage. We'll use the same metaphor. But, you don't... At the beginning, it all seems so lovely. And then one day, it's all turned to shit. I don't know how to say that in Russian. But it's ugly, and you're not getting along very well anymore, and there's decisions being made, and then the decisions are being rescinded and being made by somebody else. So, if producing is a giant, it's fun, but it's a giant headache, co-producing is like having a serious migraine.
Okay,
Miranda.
Wow, you guys are cynical.
Everyone on this side of the table is married. Miranda, less so.
I think that for me, I love co-producing. I mean, I think partnering is fantastic because, my God, making a movie is such a tremendous amount of work. And if you have somebody alongside who can share the journey with you, and it's someone you trust, it's fantastic. Especially someone who's going to be able to, on the days that you're feeling like, I don't want to talk to that lawyer again. They were just killing me yesterday. Can you take the call? Or just to be able to balance your life, because there's so many parts of producing, and it can be so exhausting that I think it's nice to share it. But in the spirit of absolutely, you do step into a deep, penetrating relationship very quickly, and you really don't know each other. I mean, often you don't know each other when you start out, and you really do get to know someone. And I would say the biggest thing for me is making sure that you have a lot of conversations up front to not just know your partner, but to make sure that you're wanting to make the same movie and that the spirit's there. Because you're going to have creative arguments, and those are fantastic. I mean, let there be arguments, and may the best idea win, and I think it makes it better. I think two brains can be really good for a film, and as long as you're, in the end, able to all have the same goal, which is a great film at the end of the line. So I think that there's a lot of pluses, especially co-producing between countries, because you've got different ideas and different philosophies, and you're bringing different things to the table, and that can be really fantastic. But I would say, as long as people have the same rigor and the same dedication, that's what helps a lot, to make sure that you're both going to be in the trenches, working hard, and in the spirit of collaboration.
I think, Hal and I had an opportunity to make Hotel Rwanda together, and we had known each other on and off, really quite casually for some time before we ended up sitting in the same boardroom together for what we thought was going to be a 2 or 3 day closing, a 2-day closing and a day of celebration and drinking champagne. And it turned into about a 17-day odyssey in which we were surrounded by takeout Indian food boxes and wondering if our families would ever see us again or whether we'd be able to pay the hotel bill and get out of there. Because each and every day of that session was a day in which we went to sleep around 2 in the morning when it was about noon in LA, having decided that it was actually impossible to close the financing for a film that was fully financed, but actually the actual physical act of getting everyone to agree to the same set of documents was so difficult that we, each and every day of that 17 days, felt as though it was not going to happen. And we really were not only desperate, but hopeless. And we'd sleep for 4 hours. We'd get up at 6 in the morning because they were awake in Johannesburg then, and come back to the room still full of takeout Indian food boxes from the day before, and just pick up the phone and kind of get back into it and work our way across the time zones from Johannesburg to Milan to London to New York to Los Angeles through the course of the next 20 hours, and find ourselves going from a point at which there was a glimmer of hope to a point at which we thought we'd succeeded, to a point by the end of the day at which we decided it was hopeless again. And we'd start again the next morning, every day for more than 2 weeks, with 3 days of underwear. And that was like a marriage that actually survived. And
Don't they have Indian takeout underwear?
they don't deliver, apparently.
You know, these co-productions are very difficult to put together, and the legal work on it is very hard. You know, the picture Marty's talking about, Hotel Rwanda, I've worked on over 400 movies in financing and packaging in my career, and that was the most difficult. It was a UK, Italian, South African co-production. And the reason we had to go to Italy is because at the time the UK and South Africa didn't have a co-production treaty. And Italy and South Africa had just signed one, and Italy had one with the UK. So we did a 3-country in order to get the benefits of the UK tax credit at the time. So we had a South African investor, we had the UK tax credit, we had money coming from Italy, we had money coming from the US. It was just a very difficult situation. And the Italian part, you know, we did it because we just had to get to the UK to get the tax credit. The Italian partner wanted an Italian actor in the movie. And there wasn't a role for an Italian actor in the movie. Marty and I had to call the director who was in pre-production in South Africa and say, we have the good news and we have bad news. The good news is we're going to get your movie financed. The bad news is you have to write in a part for an Italian priest. And and if you saw the movie where the priest runs out of the hotel and letting the people on the bus in the rain, that scene was not in the movie until we had to put together this Italian co-production.
And sadly, the priest came to Johannesburg and ended up shooting in the rain for 3 days and got pneumonia. And he's in the movie for about 7 seconds.
Was that your only Italian spend in that? Or did you have
Well, because Italy is an EU country, other spend on European elements actually qualified as Italian spend, but that was our only practical Italian element, I think. No, our composer. The composer. Andreas Guerra, one of the great Italian composers, was actually a first choice, or among the first choices for our director, and became a significant element once we had the Italian financing. So, yeah. Thanks for raising the composer question. Elena, you're about to enter a marriage, you think, on a film which started life in Russia as a Russian film, I think?
It started life in Canada.
Clearly I know nothing.
Yes.
Tell us about your project and why you think, in the wake of this discussion, you feel you'd like to enter the bonds of holy co-production.
Yes. This project started actually in Canada. There was a script written by a Canadian writer several years ago, and with the help of Telefilm for a Canadian producer. Well, yeah, was Canadian producer. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, this producer left the business and decided he's not going to be working in the film business anymore. The rights had reverted to the writer who I happen to know, and he brought it to me. And this was the time when I've met my Russian partner, who's actually just walked in, and she's right there, Maria. She had indicated that she's looking for a script for a project, for a family movie. And the family film, this is the family film. It's a film, it's a kind of story that was set for actually Winnipeg. And the story of a family and its pet parrot and the dog. So we're going to be casting the dogs. We had adapted the text to Moscow. I had the idea of adapting it to Moscow. We're going to have a father of the family, a Canadian expat living in Moscow with his Russian wife and children. And we will be shooting the film probably in English or in both languages simultaneously. And that way, because we have already a writer who is Canadian, we're going to have a Canadian star or Canadian leading actor playing a father. And then we will have Russian actors who speak English play the roles in the movie. We have probably going to have about 30% out of Canada. We're going to do all the post and all the CGI in Canada. We're probably going to have sound done in Canada. But we'll shoot everything entirely in Moscow with most likely Russian director. And eventually all the CGI animals, the Russian side is going to voice with known Russian actors. We'll do the same with Canadian. And we'll have an original English version film, which is releasable everywhere in the world, with a family story.
Fantastic. And do you know what budget you're expecting that film to be?
We're now looking at anywhere between 5 and 8. We still did not get our bid for the post, so it all depends on CGI expenditures largely right now.
And is it so 70% of your spend is going to come through? How much of your budget will come from your Russian partner then?
We are looking right now at about 70% out of Russia.
Okay. Can I get 70% for my next film out of Russia? I have a film that's scripted by a Canadian.
We can take a look at it.
Okay. I'll have to talk to Maria about that.
Yes, Maria is right there.
Okay. Kevin? Comments? Questions? Concerns?
No, I mean, I think that's a genre of movie that, you know, has some opportunity. I think it's important to you know, try to come out of it with at first, you know, they have an English language version, because as you say, it will sell, and I think that's really one of the major issues in all co-productions is, you know, it's anything that is not in English is automatically an art film. That's the way the world perceives it. You can argue with it, you can do anything you want with it, but you're not going to get distribution in the United States and in most other territories. Even the buyers who come and see it will want to see an English version. They won't even look at it unless there's an English version. That's a fact of life. So, you deal with that and move on. I think that's why you can end up in that concept with a Russian version and an English version, and you have a chance to actually make money. But I'll take 70% of that budget too. I could find a project. It would be in the winter, and it would be about hockey, and we can shoot it here.
I think one of the very interesting things about the project you describe, Elena, is the CGI component. So you've got a project in which you've got a talking parrot and a talking dog, and they can be voiced equally in Russian and in English, and in fact they can be voiced in other languages, they would be, for export to other countries. So there's a genre of film which is a family film that's tantamount to an animated film, but is in fact a live action film, but for which the element of dubbing is actually a benefit rather than a detraction.
Yeah, it's kind of a little like Babe in the Snow.
Babe in the Snow.
Remember that movie, Babe, about the Australian movie about Little Piglet?
We all remember movies that grossed over $150 million.
Frozen Pig Story.
In the context of movies that grossed over $100 million, of course, The Artist was a film not in English, and yet highly successful and distributed in the United States, if I recall.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, do you know that a film made in French, Les Intouchables, yes, has outgrossed The Artist in the world?
In the world?
In the world.
In France, certainly.
In the world.
It's proving you wrong twice, then.
That's it.
Okay. Now that we've proven that Kevin's opinion can be wrong twice in a row, I'd like to actually ask if there are questions from the audience. We'd be delighted to entertain them. Perhaps just raise your hand and indicate to me if you're interested. I see a question from the front here, and maybe we can share a microphone.
Yes.
Actually, I have a lot of questions, Martin. In the very beginning, you promised me to tell all the truth and discover almost all the secrets. So the main questions which I still have, we all know that almost just a lot of Hollywood huge productions are taking place in Canada. For example, last movie for the Warner Brothers called Seventh Son, which is shooted and done by Russian director Sergei Bodrov, is taking place in Vancouver. All the Twilight series and a lot of other movies also was shooted in Canada. So my question is, what brings the Hollywood production to the Canada? What's the maximum percentage of the tax refund and tax rebate which could be granted? Were any possibility to structure the project, the Russian-Canadian one, in a way to grant the maximum possible tax refunds? And what it depends on? What's the structure of the state support from the Canadian side, and what's the difference between the different regions of the Canada in the question of granting this support and the tax privileges? So,
it's only one question. Thank you, Elena. Yeah. You're right. That's you.
Do all of you have pajamas?
Okay. No.
We're ready.
We're going to sleep over.
Okay.
I'll start that question and have Marty finish it. When we look at productions, when producers look at productions, and when the studios look at where to shoot films, the first thing they look at is they do several budgets at different places in the States, in Canada, different countries around the world, because it all comes down to where can I go to get me the most amount of subsidies for my budget to reduce the cost. So every budget we do that, whether it's on the low-budget films or the studio films. And Canada does have some great incentives. In the States, though, we instituted a few years ago, a lot of states started to give subsidies. In Michigan, for instance, at one point they were giving up to 42% of the budget back for what you spent in the state of Michigan. In Louisiana, it's 30%. In New Mexico, it's 30%. So those are, that started to take money away, films away from going to Canada. And then Canada started increasing their subsidies, and I'll hand it off to Marty.
Well, and in between, there was a difference in the dollar. The Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar today are at parity. In those days, we were looking at the tax credit was about 25%, and the exchange rate was about 15%. So that bought Americans a lot of movies in Canada. Now that situation has changed, but the same example that Hal just gave about regions, it's very competitive within Canada. So that you can go from Vancouver to Quebec, everybody's got a competing tax rate. But where all this becomes much more interesting is really in the co-production, because you can do better, raise more money in a co-production than you can just in a service deal, which is what you're talking about. That film shooting in Vancouver, that is getting a subsidy, which is a tax refund, but there's no investment. Whereas in a co-production, a Russian-Canada co-production, for example, you could anticipate getting up to 50% and 49% of the budget of the Canadian side from the federal government, plus tax credits, plus in a place like Quebec, where there's a provincial funding agency, you can get another 15%. So it becomes, on a co-production you can get, your average Canadian movie is 70 to 75% state funded.
Maybe I don't make average movies, so I don't know. But I know that for your film.
And are you here all week?
No, you're about right. I think that there are a lot of films in Canada in the $4 to $7 million range.
Well, we don't make anything past 8, so
that are 50 to 60 or more percent funded by the state. And if you're a co-production and you have a Canadian director, then or writer, but it's hard to get investment for a non-Canadian director.
Not from television.
Okay, a Canadian writer or director, you can get into that game. It's not assured.
No, it's not assured, and it's also an investment. So they would like to see. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very often, but they would like to see money at the other end.
So you raise a very important point, which is that shooting in Canada in every region of Canada, like a number of regions of the United States, and now like the United Kingdom, there are tax credits, and certainly as in the case of the subsidies, the regional subsidies in Germany, whether they're from North Rhine-Westphalia or from the other regional funds, are intended to attract production, whether it's co-production or foreign production. As long as it's industrial production, there's a subsidy tied to how much money you spend locally. Now in Canada, that subsidy is almost doubled if your film is Canadian, if it's owned by Canadian, if the producers are Canadian, and that includes co-productions. Yeah.
I don't want to repeat what anyone said, but just to understand, if you wanted to bring your production to Canada, I mean, I think that Americans, Hollywood's attracted to Canada for two reasons. One is that there are these great tax credits, subsidies, and you were talking about the numbers. Just to bring your project there, even if there's no Canadian elements, you can get, is it 25%
Yes.
of labor or of spend?
Generally speaking, yeah.
Yeah, so basically you can get tax credits back up to about 25% of what you spend in the country, whether or not there's anything Canadian about it. So the Americans are attracted to that. They're also attracted to Canada's easy, there's great crews, it's a nice place to work, it's friendly, crews speak English, it's honest. So I think that there's, a lot of it, whereas a lot of the subsidies in the States, in sort of places like Louisiana, there's not as many crews, it's not as easy to shoot there. So I think that that's one of the attractions to Canada. And I would say, as far as just understanding this idea of co-production, these subsidies that we get, so besides just the tax credits, the fact that we can go to Telefilm Canada and a number of other sources in sort of we call soft money, we can, as Canadians, we can apply for these other pieces of funding from Canadian distributors, from a couple of smaller kind of nonprofit funding sources, and also from licensing to different television networks in the country. So as Kevin said, we can put together about 75% of the budget. When we do a co-production with Russia, for instance, you guys get to take advantage of all of that money. So because what happens is we have to have something be Canadian, there's a point system. We need either a director or an actor, either a director or a writer that's Canadian, and then you need one of the lead actors has to be Canadian, and then you need a couple of other elements, either the composer, the production designer, the cinematographer, or the editor. So when it's a co-production, those elements can also be Russian. So we can mix a Russian composer and a Russian DP or cinematographer with a Canadian production designer and a Canadian editor. And you can do your post in Canada, but you can shoot your production in Russia. And then look at how all of those, how the co-production treaty, depending on the spend in each country. So there is an advantage to shooting and to producing with Canada that way.
I want to just highlight one of the things you said, which is so true, which is ease of production in Canada. I know that, as Kevin said, the value of the Canadian dollar has been rising relative to the American dollar over the last 5 years. And the number of American incentives in particular states has been rising over that time. And yet, production in Canada has been rising steadily over that time. So why has production in Canada risen as the value of our dollar has risen? You would think that it should fall with the value of our dollar, particularly as more competitive jurisdictions open up south of our border. And the answer is reliability of crews, ease of production. You can shoot in places like Louisiana and New Mexico where we've had productions and find that you're working with a lower level of crew, a crew that has less expertise, an infrastructure which is less developed, roads that are less well paved, rural environments that are less easy to produce in, and obviously not true across the board and not true in Connecticut, but some of these productions, as Hal says, scripts come now with 6 budgets attached: the Louisiana budget, the Toronto budget, the Montreal budget, you know, the Vladivostok budget. You know, they come with all of the budgets imaginable, and people are looking at, where do I get this movie made and how do I get it made for the amount of money I can raise for it? And the infrastructure and ease of production are very significant considerations.
Actually, that's a good point. I mean, I think sometimes we look at a budget, let's say, that's been done in Louisiana or Michigan, and you think, oh, that's great because you can take advantage of that huge tax credit. But what you don't realize is they don't really have proper crews there. So sometimes you're having to fly in half your crew from somewhere else, and then all of a sudden the tax credit doesn't necessarily offset, you know, the cost. So that's just something to be aware of, is making sure that that budget can actually be produced in that territory, in that city.
So to sum up, Elena, before we go to the next question, so we've got lots of time. We got lots of time. We're not leaving. Each individual production has a variety of opportunities to bring in both subsidy money, state money, and distribution money. And as producers do all over the world, when we look at a script and we look at where is the best opportunity, so much of the particular elements of the production are significant that it's very difficult to draw a big graph and say all movies are better in this jurisdiction or in that jurisdiction. What you want to do is come to a place like this where you get an opportunity to meet producers from the countries you might want to work with and see if there's a way to actually analyze each production and determine whether there are benefits or not in having a partner, and then get into how to allocate those and assess them.
Okay, my question, I think, for Miranda, can you take your $5 million movie as an example and give like clear breakdown and explain your relationship, let's say, with private investors, if you do have private investors? For example, in those $5 million movie was $3 million private investment, and explain why those people exactly decided to invest in the movie opposed to invest in the land. I think it would be very beneficial for Russian people, because it's, let's say in Russia, if you even go to wealthy people and say, can you invest $1 million to the movie? They say, I would rather buy land rather than wait 2 years. And can you explain, like, if someone put, let's say, take bank loan against your house, again, why? Would you please explain those reasons? And if everyone else also can explain their relationship with investors and explain their experience, I will be glad to hear exact stories with exact numbers and reasons.
I appreciate your question. I think finding money for independent movies is one of the hardest sort of journeys to be on. My story for this particular movie is not so exciting. We have one financier. He's a big energy millionaire, and he just happens to be passionate about movies. So we got lucky that we had someone who was a single financier that trusted that we were going to be able to do what we said we could do, deliver the movie and sell it. So that was one. There was one person that financed that film. Having said that, it was really important to be able to say to that financier, here is how you are going to make your money back, and be able to show them very specifically that it was realistic. And one of the things that I've been doing in independent film, when we made Adam and we took it to Sundance, I can tell now out loud, as long as there's no press in the room. Off the record, we made that movie for about $650,000. And we struggled to do that, but we got it made. Our actors got scale. We gave a lot of the crew points in the back end, so we didn't pay our cinematographer much, we didn't pay our director much, we didn't pay our costume designer much, but we gave them, half a point or a point in the back end so they could feel part of it, kind of like, your old theater. And the other thing we did was make sure that we were, all of those movies, those independent films, even the $5 million movie, that we could say, that we could show that we were going to get the money back. So what we did was we went to, and you could absolutely do this with your movies, you go to an international sales agent and you get them to run the numbers. So that you give them the script and the name of the director and your cast, and they come back and they give you numbers for every single country in the world. And they say, we think we can get 200,000 out of Australia and we can get 500,000 out of France based on the elements of the movie. So then you can take that back to your financier and you can say to your financier safely, even in the worst case scenario, our foreign sales thinks they can get $5 million for this movie. And if they get more than that, it's gravy. And by the way, that doesn't even include a US sale. So that we're never making a film for more than the worst case scenario. Does that make sense?
Is anyone else want to share their experience?
I think I'm going to ask Hal to speak to that because I know that he's deeply involved in financing. I'll say that I've had, in my 20 plus years in the business, I've only had 2 films with private investors in them. And in both cases, they were investors who were high net worth individuals who were already invested in real estate and other portfolio investments, who were looking for an opportunity to diversify their investments, and who were interested in the specific subject matter of the specific films. So I made a film with Donald Sutherland and Larry Mullen Jr., the drummer from U2, called Man on a Train. It had Larry doing the soundtrack. It was music-related film, a kind of Western drama, and our particular investor was a high-net-worth individual who was an Irish-American. This was an Irish co-production, and he was particularly interested in music, so he was drawn to the material on that basis, in addition to looking at what the specific sales estimates were for each territory and how he was going to get his money out. Hal?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Marty and Miranda just said. You know, in the States, we have the state subsidies, but we don't have any other government funding for films. So most of the films, and all the ones that I've worked on, you know, have high net worth individuals investing in the films and private equity investment. And as Marty said, most of the people investing in films are not investing to make a huge return. They're not. That's not the reason they're doing it. If they were going to invest in something, they'd invest in real estate or they'd invest in, you know, the stock market. If they invest in film, there's another reason why they want to be involved in film. Whether it's, you know, they have some creative urge, they've made a lot of money from other business and they just want to be involved. There's some reason they want to be involved in movies. And what we do as financiers and helping arrange the financing and working with these high net worth individuals is to protect their risk as much as possible. And that's all you can do in film, is limit your downside risk. And that's a matter of going to a foreign sales agent, as Miranda said, getting foreign sales estimates, getting bank financing, going to a state or a country where you get the most subsidy, and limiting that equity risk to as little as possible. And what we try and do is get that equity investment down to maybe 15, 20% to maybe 50% maximum in a film. I wouldn't suggest 100% financing a film. Limit your equity investment, have estimates that make sense for the value of your budget, and make the film for as low as possible. That's how we mitigate risk and try and protect the investors.
There was another question.
Just to elaborate on what Mr. Sadoff said, well, sales agency, sometimes they give you this estimate, but it's not bankable. You cannot raise any money from it. You cannot go to the bank and receive a loan. So what's the difference between bankable sales estimate, firm sales estimate, and the sort of soft and very soft ones?
There are actual pre-sales that a sales company would make, an actual sale, a contract. Then there are sales estimates. And if it's a reputable sales company, and there are many of them around the world in different countries, there are banks that will lend a certain percentage against those estimates. It's called gap financing. And a bank will lend, you know, up to 15 or even 20% of the budget against those sales estimates. If there's a certain amount of coverage against those, in other words, additional, if there's $5 million and $10 million in estimates, they'll lend, $1.5 million or $2 million against those.
I think it's fair to say, Hal, I think you'd agree, that in these cases of banking sales estimates, you raise a very important point. Generally what we see is that lenders want to see the sales estimates proven by sales in 2 or 3 major territories. So if you've got sales estimates that total $5 million or $7 million or $20 million, and you go through each country and you say, well, in order to get $20 million value for this film, Germany must be worth at least 2.5 million euros. Otherwise, the numbers will never add up. If Germany's not worth 2.5 million euros, Australia will never be worth 1 million Australian dollars, and Korea will never be worth $200,000, and so all the numbers will come down. So you need to have a reputable sales agent, and then have to prove or show evidence that those sales estimates are reliable by pre-selling a couple of major territories at least the value shown in those sales estimates. When you've got that, you can take those to certain lenders and say, here are the sales estimates, here are the pre-sales in 2 of these major territories showing that these sales estimates are reliable, and usually a lender will lend, depending on the bankability of the sales agent, up to a certain percentage of the total sales estimate value, usually a half and maybe a little bit more than that of the value of the sales estimates. Kevin?
Can you just list these reputable sales agencies so people know and how one can become their client?
Yes, I think you want to just talk to Hal in the hallway after and get a list of the reliable sales agents that are bankable, because they change from, in fact, many banks have lists of sales agents who are acceptable, and based on what their previous sales estimates were and how well they did at meeting or exceeding those targets. And so those change. But the way to learn this stuff is to talk to the lenders, talk to the banks, talk to the people who you would be going to for a loan, and also go to the markets. Go to Cannes, go to the Berlinale, go to the American Film Market, go to the Moscow Business Square, and talk to the people who are there about who's reliable currently in the market. Okay?
Well, I just wanted to say that one of the ironies of the Canadian system, which is a highly subsidized system, is that it, in fact, discourages private investment, because private investment usually has a recoupment position which is more favorable. So people that actually invest their money want to get it back first. And in Canada, that doesn't happen. If Telefilm Canada invests in, they want pari passu, they want to be in the first position. So that actually is a detriment to raising private financing.
I think one of the impressions we have from this panel is that the co-production system with the co-production system in Canada is one of the best in the world, and we're all very tempted to enter in this relationship. But the question that I have is for all of you: what are the conditions that you would view if the film is shot in Russian language? Because everything we're discussing here is basically for the projects that are shot in English. But if the film is in Russian, what would be for you the conditions to enter this kind of co-production partnership? Thank you.
Well, okay, go ahead.
I'm not afraid of a Russian movie. I mean, to me, it's all about the story, and I know I'm just repeating, it's script, but if there's a great story and someone brings me a script, I mean, I obviously don't read Russian, but if somebody could read the translation to me or send me a translation at the same time and I fall in love with it and I say, I think this movie is really special, then, I think audiences are we're getting more global with everything that's happening in the internet, and I feel like audiences are getting more sophisticated, film audiences, and they want things that are special and different and unique. And there's a whole bunch of stories that haven't been told out of this country. And I think that you guys have a wealth of amazing, stunning beauty and certainly a literary history that's extraordinary, and not all of those have been turned into films. I think there's vast stories to come out of this country, and I'd absolutely consider a co-production that shoots in Russia in Russian if I really loved it, you know.
As I'm passing the mic to Kevin, I'm reminded of a story about the new Agnieszka Holland film. In English, it's called In Darkness. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film this past year. This is a film that was written in English by a Canadian writer. He brought it to me, and I read it and said, that's a terrific, moving story. It's about Jews who were hidden in the sewers of Poland during the Second World War and emerged afterward and were happy to be alive. And I said, you know, the market for Second World War melodrama is on the saturated side now, and I don't think that an English language film like this can get made. I could be wrong. I'm often wrong, as Kevin will point out, but I'm not sure I know how to get this film made. And he took that film then to Agnieszka and said they decided together to translate it into the original languages in which the characters in the film speak. So the film was ultimately produced in German, Polish, and Yiddish. It was produced, it's beautifully done. They got great actors out of Europe who spoke those languages fluently as their characters. And the film went on to incredible acclaim. It, in Poland, ended up outgrossing every other movie ever made, including Avatar and The Artist, and being nominated for an Academy Award. Sorry, I don't think it was nominated for Best Picture. I think it was nominated for Best Foreign Film. Best Foreign Film, but foreign language film. And so there's an example where being not in English was a benefit to the film, and I think Miranda might be right that there's an opportunity for that. I will say that Telefilm Canada can only invest in films that are English language, French language, or a language of a First Nation or Aboriginal people in Canada, and therefore not in Yiddish, Polish, or German. And so they were not an investor in that film, to their dismay.
But it was a co-production with Canada, and while it may have done boffo box office in Poland, it died in Canada. Nobody went to see it. So, Joe, just let me ask you. Well, except Marty. In fact, he bought many. But let me ask you, and this is really one of the salient points of this discussion, which is always, yes, it's lovely, I mean, I agree, to make a film. But in order to make a film in Canada, you need to get a distributor. If I bring a distributor a Russian language film, he's going to go, what? How much money do you want? And I'm going to say, well, I would like, 10% of the budget. And he'll go, I could buy this in Cannes for $12. That's reality. Next point. How many of you, what's the last Canadian movie you saw? Thank you. And how many Russian movies get distributed in Canada? It only works mathematically. The fact is that in Canada we have less and less distribution opportunities. We have more and more screens showing exactly the same movie. And you can't get a non-English language film. Rarely can you get one distributed.
It's highly competitive. The Americans dominate. We all know this. I appreciate everything Kevin's saying, but I also, a number of years ago, I was the director of development at Robert Redford's company at Wildwood, and we developed a project called the Motorcycle Diaries. And that was an interesting project because Walter Salas came on board, and we talked about actually making it in English, and then ultimately made the decision to make it in Spanish, and thought that it would just sell better because it was going to be closer to the material. And the way that we developed it, because we the development executives didn't speak Spanish, and we hired a playwright, Jose Rivera, to do the script, who obviously spoke Spanish and English, and so he and Walter, they wrote the draft in. Jose wrote the draft in English. We did all our notes until we were all happy with the draft, and then translated it back into Spanish, and then made the film. So I think that there's an opportunity to do that with a Russian film just as much and develop. I think in the end, you've got to make these movies for a price that makes sense. You can't make big budget films in foreign languages because they're going to be difficult to sell around the world. But as a separation showed this year, there are foreign films in a lot of different languages that appeal to international audiences. And I think if you're making it for a price and you've got a filmmaker that's passionate and you're passionate about it, it's worth putting into the world.
That's a very optimistic note. We may have time for one more question.
I actually have a question for
Elena?
you, Marty. Yes. I have a question of why do you think to this point we didn't make a Canadian-Russian co-production? Is there something in a treaty that prevents us to do it? And if there is, what is this, and what can we do to work together to correct that?
I think two things. I think one, ease of production. So I think there's a perception that it's challenging to shoot in Russia. Just as I'm here to tell you, it's challenging to shoot in New Mexico. And in New Mexico, you can fly in crew from California if you have to. In Russia, the perception is that it's more difficult to get the crew. And part of that is because we haven't done it before, we're not doing it now. So it always takes the first attempt to break through the perception and get something done. The other challenge I think that we've endured in the time since we signed the treaty is the value that can be brought from each country. If we can bring 70% of the production value from Canada, can we bring 30% of that value from Russia? And I don't think it's been shown yet. I think maybe you can comment on this, Kevin, having looked at one Russian project every 14 months or so in the last decade and a half. Do those projects come with producers saying, we can bring 30 to 70% of the budget from Russia if you can bring the other 30 to 70%? My sense is that there has not been a combination of Russian distribution, Russian investment, state subsidy that combined adds up to a significant enough portion of the production budget to generate that meeting of the two co-production companies to create a film whose value is 100%. And based on what we've learned here in the last few days at the festival and here at the Business Square, I think that has changed. I think that may be in the process of changing with the foundation and the fund and with the power of some of the production companies in Russia. I think that's different, it seems to me. And if that is, then just as each script comes with budgets attached to them for different jurisdictions, so too those budgets come with finance plans attached to them. And so if you shoot this in New Mexico, we can bring this portion of the budget through state subsidy and foreign or local distribution advance. When we look at it in Canada, we have the same thing. And if we can look at that finance plan and say, here's a finance plan for a €4.5 million movie, and we can, how much of that can we bring as your partner from Russia to this movie, and how well does it marry with the financing that you can bring? And that's really the challenge. That's the test. I think that's where the relationship has fallen short in the past, and I think that's the opportunity for the future. And on that note, if there are no other questions, I'm prepared to adjourn this meeting. Thank you.